The reason I am here today, or the topic I am here today with, is basically to summarize very quickly in 50 minutes, to summarize some of the thoughts I had about something called Holocaust distortion, which has become, not overnight, but over the last few years, a huge problem in terms of basically changing our perceptions of the past. So a small book, but packed with, I would say, certain conclusions I would like to share with you. So, without further ado, let me start with a citation from a colleague of mine, one of the most eminent Israeli scholars, Yehuda Bauer, an eminent scholar of the Holocaust, who wrote, actually he's 97 now, and he wrote it 2 years ago. The notion of a usable past is a key in order to fortify national consciousness and therefore the nationalist political leadership. A past has to be found that can be used to educate, more precisely to indoctrinate the nation, young and old. When such an uplifting past is not available, it has to be invented. So this will be basically a trail I would like to follow in this talk. On the evening of May 30, 2023, I strolled along Ujazdowskie Avenue in a prestigious Warsaw neighborhood towards the neoclassicist building housing the German Historical Institute, where I was to deliver a lecture titled "The Polish Growing Problem with the Holocaust." In front of the institute, I saw 2 police vans, lights flashing, with several officers and a growing number of agitated people congregating around the entrance. On my way in, I noticed hostile stares and overheard obscenities thrown in my direction. If I were a politician or a media personality, the scene might somehow have made some sense. But for a researcher and a historian whose publications were usually absorbed by a small circle of academic colleagues, all of this was rather unusual. The demonstrators, as I learned, had been mobilized by one Robert Bąkiewicz, a right-wing extremist, a candidate to the parliament and darling of the Polish authorities, well funded by the state. In front of me, protesters, some of them with children, held banners which read, "German crimes, German responsibility. Poles were the victims," and "Germans murdered 6 million Poles." This last poster would have come as a surprise to the 3 million murdered Polish Jews who posthumously and rather unceremoniously have been recruited to the cause of Polish martyrdom, with which they had little or nothing to do. Inside the German Historical Institute, in the lecture room, the atmosphere was tense. Seated in the front row, glaring at me, was Grzegorz Braun, a member of the Polish parliament and a militant anti-Semite with his entourage. Further back, I saw several other nationalist employees of the Institute of National Remembrance, a state institution charged with the enforcement of the official party line in matters of history. I knew that this crowd was not here to discuss history, but to confront me and to vent their anger at the, quotation, anti-Polish lies and conspiracy, as the government propaganda refers to works of historians trying to shed light on more controversial aspects of national past. Nevertheless, while I was prepared for a hostile Q&A session, I was not ready for physical confrontation and violence which ensued. I had barely finished the introduction when Braun jumped to his feet, crossed the floor, grabbed the heavy microphone from the stand, and, shouting "enough," started to smash the microphone on the podium right in front of me. A moment later, dropping what remained of the microphone to the floor, he rushed towards the loudspeakers and threw them to the ground, ripping out the electric cords as he moved around the room. Mayhem erupted. The lecture was over. Students who came to hear the talk, some of them visibly traumatized and crying, started to shout, pointing at Braun, "Shame, shame." Close to me, one of the journalists who had arrived with the Polish parliamentarian hissed, "Jewish lies." Finally, the police made their appearance and did nothing. Back in 2023, doing nothing in the face of violence perpetrated by nationalists and right-wing extremists had become a behavior pattern for the agents of the Polish state. The sight of the raging extremist politician flanked by immobile police will be one of the enduring impressions of that evening. Another impression, much more important, was the realization that scholars of the Holocaust were no longer victims only of verbal campaigns of hate, orchestrated by the authorities. In Poland, words of hate have mutated into acts of physical violence directed against those who refuse to follow the official state-approved historical narrative. The 1930s meet the 2020s, 100 years of lessons unlearned and forgotten. So what was it that Brown prevented me from saying? In short, I wanted to argue that however surprising it may sound, the question of Polish complicity in the Holocaust has become more contentious and divisive the further we are removed from the event itself. That the history of Shoah in today's Poland is being corroded by the toxic mix of government policies of negationism and distortion willingly accepted by the broader public. That Poland has become a champion worldwide of Holocaust relativization, Holocaust de-Judaization, and Holocaust envy. Finally, I wanted to talk about the success of these memorial policies, which over the years have transformed how Poles see their own past and how they construe their own identity. By the way, I'm speaking about Poland, but the issue is much more, of course, universal. In most of these cases, you can supplant Poland for a number of other countries. Why Poland? Why is the Polish case so vital to the memory of the Shoah? First, Poland is the place where Holocaust was perpetrated. It's here on pre-war Polish territory that close to 5 out of 6 million Jews were put to death. The Jewish community in Poland was the largest in Europe and second largest in the world after the United States. Second, out of 3 million Polish Jews who at some point found themselves, it's important to think, who at some point found themselves under German occupation, fewer than 30,000 survived the war. The survival rate for Polish Jews was therefore close to 1%. Nowhere else in Europe was the Holocaust so complete, so total. Nowhere else did the destruction of the Jewish people proceed with such a nightmarish perfection. Third, Poland is where the Germans established all the extermination camps: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Chełmno, Sobibór, Majdanek, and Bełżec. This in turn imposed on Polish society and the Polish state a unique obligation of memory, a duty of caring for the spaces of horror and for the symbolic commemoration of one of the largest human catastrophes in history. That's why Poland, despite itself, has become a reluctant custodian of the memory of the Shoah. These 3 reasons alone are enough to make us consider Poland in matters of memory and commemoration of the Shoah a place of unique importance. Unfortunately, the politics of memory pursued and enforced in Poland are nowadays best described as Holocaust distortion. Holocaust deniers of yesterday, states, institutions, and unlike Holocaust deniers of yesteryear, states, institutions, and people engaged in Holocaust distortion do not deny the factuality of Jewish catastrophe. They freely admit that the Germans murdered 6 million European Jews. What they refuse to acknowledge, however, is that their people, their nation, had something to do with the event, that their ancestors took part in the German genocidal project. Holocaust distortion or negationism is a particularly insidious threat to our collective memory, as it's partially based on truth. No one denies, for instance, that some Gentiles helped the Jews. The negationists insist, however, that helping Jews was the default position of their nation, that they claim that Polish or Hungarian or Lithuanian or Romanian or Ukrainian society did all it could to save its Jewish citizens in their moment of need. In practical terms, in Poland, it means shifting the entire blame to the Germans, regardless of the level of complicity of local Gentiles. It was best summed up by the Polish writer and historian very famous, Kazimierz Wyka, who shortly after the war, referring to the massive amount of Jewish real estate left in the hands of Poles, wrote, I quote, "To the Germans all the blame, to us the keys and the cash," end quote. Enforcing the lies. From the very beginning of the century, the politics of memory started to play a prominent role in Poland. This phenomenon was in part due to the expectations of the European Union, which pressured its future members to align their understanding of the Shoah with what Western democracies considered the dominant narrative. A narrative which recognized that the Holocaust was not only a German project, and that all European nations were also, to some extent, responsible for the Jewish catastrophe. The Holocaust found itself early on at the very center of Polish memorial policies because it was the only part of Polish history which had a universal meaning. Though few people outside of Poland knew anything about Polish history, almost all have heard something about Auschwitz. The Holocaust was, therefore, the only part of Polish history that the Polish authorities had no control over. To gain control over the Holocaust narrative has become the main or one of the main objectives of the history policy of the Polish state. Now, Polish lawfare. Polish and state institutions, memorial museums, traveling exhibitions, and school curricula all repeat the same message of Polish national innocence during the Holocaust. Those who fail to understand, or worse, reject the official narrative of the state, may face laws intended to enforce obedience. Those legal regulations meant to defend the honor of the nation are styled after legislation harking back to the 1930s. In January 2018, the Polish parliament voted in so-called Polish Holocaust law. To be more precise, changes to the law regarding the Institute of National Remembrance, which, among many other things, threatened those who, I quote, blamed Polish society for crimes committed by the Nazi Third Reich, end quote, with prison terms of up to 3 years. Perceived as a threat to further study of the Holocaust and an assault on the memory of one of the greatest crimes in history, the passage of the bill raised protests around the world. At the end of June 2018, in the face of international indignation, the Polish parliament withdrew the criminal provisions of the bill, and Prime Minister Morawiecki at the time said in the parliament, I quote, "Those who claim that the Polish nation or the Polish state bear responsibility for the crimes of World War II should, of course, be in prison. But we have to act bearing in mind international realities." Morawiecki assured the parliament at the same time that the Polish state still had enough tools at its disposal to inflict pain on offenders, especially through civil litigation. Indeed, this scenario or plan of action against Polish historians was soon tested in Polish courts. On February 9, 2021, I listened as Judge Ewa Jończyk of the Warsaw District Court rendered her judgment in the civil lawsuit filed by Filomena Leszczyńska against historians Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski. The plaintiff claimed that the defendants, in a recently published academic book, Night Without End, 2 volumes, 3,500 footnotes, slandered the memory of her long-deceased uncle, wrongly accusing him of having betrayed hidden Jews to Germans during the occupation. On the surface, the case looked like a fairly standard lawsuit filed by a party wishing to defend the good name of her family. In reality, the case was prepared, financed by the Redoubt of Defense of the Good Name of the Polish Nation, a far right-wing nationalistic organization serving as a proxy for the Polish state. The judgment covered 37 pages, but a few sentences were of particular significance for historians, and especially for historians of Holocaust. And here I quote, "In light of the above presented ideas and jurisprudence, we can assume that ascribing to Poles the crimes of the Holocaust committed by the Third Reich can be construed as hurtful and striking at the feeling of identity and national pride. This forms, among the public opinion, a drastically untrue image of Poland and ascribes to Poles characteristics which tear away their dignity and undermine sense of their own value. To blame Poles for the Holocaust, for the killing of Jews during World War II, and for seizing their property touches on the sphere of national legacy and consequently, as completely untrue and hurtful, can impact one's feeling of national dignity. End quote. Judge Jończyk's verdict sent a chill down the collective spine of the academic community in Poland and abroad. The decision went far beyond anything the plaintiff asked for and was a brazen attempt to regulate the behavior of scholars, researchers, and educators. In the opening phrase, the judge warned, I quote, that ascribing to Poles the crimes of the Holocaust committed by the Third Reich, end quote, which was borrowed word for word from Article 55A of the infamous Polish Holocaust law. But Judge Jończyk went further. Here, for the first time, the court decided what had actually happened during the Holocaust in Poland. Or, to be more precise, the judge decided what had not happened during the Holocaust in Poland. And so, according to the court, during World War II, the Poles did not kill the Jews, and they did not rob them of their property. This came as a surprise to historians of the Shoah, who for years had conclusively demonstrated the opposite. The largely uncontested consensus, discounting employees of the IPN and other state institutions in Poland, is that segments of Polish society took advantage of or took part in the German genocidal plan. To declare that all of these historical findings were, to quote Judge Jończyk, once again completely untrue, was disingenuous, false, and morally reprehensible. In justification of the verdict, the judge also made repeated references to terms such as national pride, national dignity, which, as we learned, deserved legal protection. Neither expression can be legally defined. National pride and national dignity exist in the eye of the beholder. Should the protection of these terms be entrenched in civil jurisprudence, the possibilities of litigation against scholars would become endless. In the end, we won on appeal. The process, the trial, took nearly 3 stressful years and involved a considerable financial burden. A wave of state-sponsored hate accompanied the court proceedings, including relentless attacks by Polish public TV, radio, and press. Confronting the might of this hostile state is not something that scholars are either trained or expected to endure. Hearing the news about the decision of the higher court, Zbigniew Ziobro, who was then Polish Minister of Justice, could not contain himself. He issued a public statement, I quote, "According to the appellate court, the authors of the book Night Without End are academics so they can lie without punishment. They can transform a hero into a criminal. It not only brings shame to the court, it's a judicial coup d'etat against justice itself." End quote. Przemysław Czarnek, the Minister of Education, was equally blunt. I quote, "Night Without End is an anti-Polish rag," end quote. Nawrocki, the recently appointed chief of the IPN, declared in an interview, I quote, "The authors of Night Without End are haters and academic frauds," end quote. There are laws that do not have to be enforced. It is enough that they are on the books, ready to be used against offending historians, educators, and teachers. Nothing more is needed to create a chilling atmosphere which stifles research and controversial aspects of nations past. If authorities can put through the legal grinder 2 senior and internationally recognized academics, junior scholars will ask themselves what might happen to less-known defendants. In this way, the Polish state has already won a major battle. The righteous defense. Until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the so-called dignity file, also known as the defense of the good name of the nation, was the only issue on which Polish nationalists came together with the representatives of democratic opposition. This united stand, which builds a bridge between the Polish left and right, extending from communists to fascists, and including the parties of the moderate center, has a long historical tradition. And the strongest pillar supporting this construct is undoubtedly the poorly construed idea of raison d'etat, or the greater good of the state, which is often laced in Poland with anti-Semitic overtones. Voting patterns in the Polish parliament confirm this pernicious phenomenon. In January 2018, Polish parliamentarians overwhelmingly voted in favor of the previously mentioned Polish Holocaust law, one of the more disgraceful pieces of legislation in recent memory. In fact, only 4 members of the Sejm voted against it, while 409 either voted in favor or abstained. The same sentiment of unity allowed Polish parliamentarians to acknowledge and to honor as, I quote, true patriots, the extreme nationalists and murderers of Jews from the Holy Cross Brigade of the National Armed Forces, and to recognize as heroes the cursed soldiers, post-1945 anti-communist fighters, many of whom are well-documented killers of Jews. And then there was the righteous defense. Massive resources of the state have been committed to reinforcing the myth of masses, millions of Poles allegedly rescuing Jews, both for internal consumption and for international use. The results, unfortunately, from a historian's point of view, were encouraging. For the state, the Poles confirmed it again and again. Over the years, Poles have been asked a question: who suffered more during the war, the Jewish or the Polish nation? In 1992, 46% of those polled replied that Jews suffered more, 46%. By 2021, this opinion was shared only by 28% of respondents. The percentage of those who thought that both nations suffered equally grew steadily, from 32% in 1992 to 51% in 2021. Finally, in 2021, a stunning 71% of Polish respondents came to the conclusion that during World War II, Poles suffered as much or more than the Jews. Professor Marek Kucia, a sociologist working in Jagielloński University in Kraków, has been researching these issues for decades. In 2021, he found that the overwhelming majority, 84% of Poles, were convinced that their ancestors under the occupation helped the Jews, I quote, as much as they could, end quote. The fact that 99% of Polish Jews perished in the Shoah does not seem to bother people anymore. Despite the occasional road bump, the defense of the good nation seems to have won the day, trumping historical evidence and the existing scholarship, making Poland sui generis leader in Holocaust distortion worldwide. The triumphant march of negationism comes with a hefty price tag, which should have us all concerned. According to Kucia's studies, 55% of Poles think, I quote, that Jews have too much influence in the world, and 41% declare that Jews cannot change their bad national characteristic, I quote, because that's their nature, end quote. 19% claimed at the same time that, I quote, war was a horrible thing, but it's good that as a result we do not have as many Jews in Poland as we used to have, end quote. This was the opinion held by every 5th person polled in 2021 in a country which 3 generations earlier was the killing ground for 5 out of 6 million victims of the Holocaust. Anti-communism trumps anti-Semitism. Samek Abrahamer was a survivor. He survived in the Holocaust in Warsaw, in hiding, together with his wife and daughter on the Aryan side of the city. In early 1944, running out of money and fearing denunciation and death, the family escaped to Hungary. Their flight from Warsaw through much of Poland, over the Slovak mountains and into Budapest must have been a harrowing experience, but they made it to the Hungarian capital. In the winter of 1944, Hungary was widely perceived as a safe refuge, a safe haven for Jews, especially when compared to the killing fields in Poland. In March 1944, however, the Wehrmacht entered Hungary, and soon the massive deportations of Hungarian Jews began. All in all, between May and July 1944, more than 430,000 Jews were sent from Hungary to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Very few survived. The Abrahamer family again managed to avoid the hunt, and soon after liberation in winter 1945, they returned to Poland, to their native Kraków. Samek came back to reclaim the businesses of his father, Israel Abrahamer, a wealthy Kraków miller, industrialist, and philanthropist who had been murdered by the Germans in August 1942. Full disclosure, Samek's brother, Josue Abrahamer, was my grandfather. In 1945, unwilling to go back to his real name, Josue decided to legalize his Aryan papers, which had served him so well during the war, and officially changed his name to Czesław Grabowski. Samek, on the other hand, decided to keep his Jewish name. These decisions, in either case, could not have been easy. After the war, and despite liberation, Poland remained a scary place for Jews. Historians have no precise numbers, but during the 1945-47 period, anywhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Jews were murdered. Members of various anti-communist organizations targeted the Jews, later explaining away murders with patriotic excuses of fighting communism or the famous Judeo-Commune. Scores died in so-called railway action, Akcja Pociągowa, in which posses of bandits roamed trains looking for Jews, and then there were the pogroms, first in June 45 Rzeszów, then August 45 Kraków, and finally the bloodiest of them all in Kielce in July 1946. This was the social and political climate in which Samek Abrahamer took over the businesses of his murdered father, but not for long. On April 8, 1946, shortly before 6 p.m., Samek left the mill in Zielonki, a suburb of Kraków, in the company of his secretary, the 20-year-old Zofia Scheinborn. They took a droszki, a horse-drawn cart which back then substituted for a taxi. Outside the gate of the mill compound, on the Kraków highway, 3 men waited in ambush. They stopped the droszki, ordered the cart driver to stand aside, and opened fire on the passengers. Samek was shot in the head and the chest. His secretary was repeatedly shot in the chest and in the abdomen. Both died of their wounds the next day in the hospital. According to the report filed later by the militia, the murderers spared the life of Polish droszki driver and stole whatever they could find on the victims: 4,000 zlotys, watches, Samek's wedding ring, 2 pairs of gloves, a woman's purse, a leather briefcase, and 2 winter coats. Samek was buried in a ruined and robbed Jewish cemetery on Miodowa Street. His brother Josue, now Czesław, did not attend his funeral. He was too afraid to board a train from Warsaw, where he lived, to Kraków. A few months later, the murderers, involved in the killings also of several other Jews, were caught by the militia. As the investigators soon learned, all belonged to the Battalion of Anti-Comintern Self-Defense, one of the many units of anti-communist and patriotic resistance. Neither Samek nor his secretary were communists, but they were wealthy Jews, which in the eyes of Polish anti-communist fighters was more than enough reason to kill them. In today's Poland, these murderers are treated as heroes, whose moral choices should set example for the young generation. Called cursed soldiers, żołnierze wyklęci, they symbolize the struggle of the Polish society against Soviet-imposed communism. Józef Kuraś, who went by the nom de guerre Fire, was perhaps the most iconic and celebrated among the cursed soldiers. He fought the Germans, and later he fought the communists. For Kuraś, the struggle against communists involved killing Jews. He made no distinction between them. In May 1946, in one of the more notorious cases, his men killed a group of Jews fleeing Poland. 11 people were executed, while 7 others, though wounded, managed to flee: women, men, children, survivors or unsurvivors of the Holocaust. It so happens that the killers of Samek Abrahamer and Zofia Scheinborn belong to Kuraś underground resistance network. Józef Kuraś is nowadays hailed as a national hero. In 2006, then President Lech Kaczyński unveiled his monument in Zakopane in southern Poland. In 2011, long before the authoritarian turn in Polish politics, Kaczyński's successor, President Komorowski, declared 1st of March the National Day of Remembrance of the Cursed Soldiers. Kuraś's deeds are celebrated in museums, and Polish scouts take part in raids and expeditions bearing his name. In March 23, the Polish National Mint issued a new 10 zloty coin in sterling silver with his portrait. Beneath his portrait, a legend reads, "They acted," I quote, they acted as one should have, zachowali się jak trzeba. In Poland, killing Jews is no longer odious. Killing Jews is irrelevant as long as the murderers can present impeccable anti-communist credentials. Polonizing Treblinka, Part 1. Treblinka death camp is the second largest Jewish cemetery in the world after Auschwitz. Here, on a small patch of land hidden in the forest of East Poland, the Germans murdered close to 900,000 Jews. The victims were brought to this remote area known as Podlasie from around Poland and other occupied countries by train, sometimes up to 12,000 people per transport. Usually the trains waited for hours, sometimes days, at the Treblinka railway station before the wagons with their human cargo were pushed into the camp nearby. The conditions in the wagons were beyond description, with people packed 150 in each of them, dying of wounds, heat and thirst. Between July 42 and August 43, the small railway station became a true gateway to hell. Out of the 900,000 Jews brought there, little more than 100 survived the war. Some decided to share their stories. On 23rd of August 1942, during the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, Jankiel Wiernik was caught in a manhunt and the next day found himself at Treblinka railway station. His testimony, among the earliest to be published still during the war, after his successful escape, I quote, "The train moved in the morning and we rolled into the Treblinka railway station. It was a hot day. We could hardly breathe. We were horribly thirsty. I looked out the window. The peasants brought water and asked for 100 zlotys per bottle. I had no money, so I had to forego water. Others, however, paid the money." Eddie Weinstein from town of Łosice arrived at Treblinka station a day after Wiernik, on 25th of August 1942. He described the situation on the ramp. "We were horribly thirsty and we had no idea what would happen with us. But even in these circumstances, money and jewelry, even more so, were still appreciated. The Poles who worked on the station came to an SS soldier and asked him for permission to bring water to the thirsty people. The soldier gave his consent. So they brought buckets of water close to the wagons and started filling empty bottles handed over by the passengers. For this, they wanted good payment. They clearly considered Polish bills worthless, and they only took hard currency and precious objects such as rings and brooches. Without them, it was impossible to get water. These merciful Poles split the profits with the soldiers. Someone in our wagon gave them a few gold coins, and in return we received a real treasure, a small bucket of water." Abram Jakub Krzepicki found himself at the railway station in Treblinka one day later, 26th of August 42, a day after Eddie Weinstein. Eventually, he managed to flee Treblinka and return to the Warsaw Ghetto during the summer of 42 to leave a record. And he died later on. The situation, I quote, "The situation in the wagon deteriorated quickly. Water. We begged the railway workers through the window. We offered them a lot of money. It was awful. But we had not enough money to cover the cost of water. People paid 500 and 1,000 zlotys for a few sips of water. The railway workers and the auxiliaries took the money. He who had not lived through it won't believe. I paid 500 zloty, more than one half of what I had, and received a jar, half a liter of water. When I started drinking, a woman rushed to me, crying that her child had fainted. I drank and I could not take the jar away from my mouth. The woman bit me on the hand as hard as she could. She wanted to force me to stop drinking, to leave some water for her." There are a few other testimonies that all of them point to the same fact, that the railway workers, could gain access to death trains, and this was a real El Dorado, a mythical city of gold in this remote corner of eastern Poland. Murderous greed spilled all over the area. Samuel Reitzman, who fled Treblinka after the uprising in 43, wrote, "The peasants around Treblinka were particularly hostile to Jews. They caught the children and led them to Treblinka camp on a rope like calves to be murdered. Their reward was 250 grams of sugar, sometimes nothing at all. The villages surrounding Treblinka are today full of treasures in gold taken away from the Jews." That was 1942. Treblinka, Polonizing Treblinka Part 2 now. Magdalena Gawin, Poland's Deputy Minister of Culture and National Heritage, arrived at station in Treblinka on November 25, 2021, 80 years after Wiernik, Reitzman, Krzepicki, Weinstein and 900,000 other Jews. Flanked by officials, members of the press, employees of Pilecki Institute, which were responsible for the event, 4 Catholic priests and Rabbi Yehoshua Elis, who ensured a token but indispensable Jewish presence, she shared an optimistic message of hope. The Jews did not die alone, she said. I quote, "This place," she declared, "is so special and so deeply marked by the suffering of thousands of innocent people that all of us, we should work together so that good can emerge from this tragedy out of the sacrifice of these young men," end quote. The young man was Jan Maletka, a Polish railway worker from a local village who, according to the employees of Pilecki Institute responsible for the event, had been shot by the Germans at Treblinka station for delivering water to the dying Jews. The crucial part, insisted the Pilecki people, was that Maletka acted out of goodness of his heart. While there is no question that Maletka was shot on the station on August 24, 1942, there is not a shred of credible historical evidence that the young railway worker was trying to help the Jews for altruistic reasons. There is, however, overwhelming evidence from Jewish survivors that water at the railway station in Treblinka was not given but sold to dying Jews at outrageous prices. To celebrate Polish suffering and sacrifice, Gawin unveiled a monument with a sign in Polish and English which read, I quote, "In memory of Jan Maletka, murdered by the Germans on August 20, 1942, for helping Jews. In memory of Jews murdered at the Nazi German extermination camp in Treblinka," end quote. The monument to the railway to Jan Maletka and 900,000 anonymous Jews now sits on the former Treblinka railway station and will remain there until the end of days. In this way, among the religious and secular celebrations, in the company of Catholic priest and a rabbi, one of the last places devoted solely to the memory of Jewish suffering and tragedy was appropriated by Polish officials for the purposes of Polish martyrdom. The unveiling of the Maletka monument was the most brazen and outrageous act of Pilecki Institute, but was not the first. Actually, there are 10 similar monuments in the vicinity of Treblinka fighting for the appropriation of the space. The monuments erected by Pilecki propagandists alone are not enough to appropriate Treblinka for the purpose of Polish national mythology. The memorial takeover is anchored in Treblinka 1. Few people know that there were 2 camps in Treblinka. The first opened in autumn of 1941 and was a labor camp. Treblinka 1, which used the Jewish and Polish inmates to work in a gravel pit. It was a camp with a brutal regime, and according to less than precise statistics, out of 20,000 people who went through Treblinka 1, at least 10,000 died, vast majority of them Jews. The labor camp was closed in mid-1944, shortly before the arrival of the Red Army. In the spring of 1942, 2 kilometers away, the Germans started construction of Treblinka 2, the notorious death camp. The first transport of Jews from Warsaw Ghetto to be gassed here was on July 23, 1942. The Polish inmates sent to Treblinka 1 were usual local peasants arrested by the Germans for failing to deliver quotas of meat, rye, or wheat, or accused of black marketeering of various forms. The working conditions were appalling, the overseers cruel, while many, around 300 according to rather precise counts, Polish inmates died in Treblinka 1, their situation was incomparably better than that of thousands of Jewish slaves who were sent there without exception to die. Today, the place where Jewish inmates were executed at Treblinka 1 is a field of crosses, 296 of them at last count, commemorating the Polish victims of the camp. The great majority of the victims, I repeat, of Treblinka 1 were Jews, including hundreds of children. But this message cannot be conveyed anymore. This is how Treblinka 1, largely Polonized, has become the counterweight to the Jewish Treblinka 2. Covered with rows of crosses and appropriated for Catholic rituals, the labor camp and adjacent area are often referred to in Poland as our Treblinka. One objective of Holocaust distortion is to elevate your own suffering to the level of Jewish suffering, blending the narratives of Treblinka 1 and Treblinka II, domesticating the name for your own purposes, is an important step in this direction. Not surprisingly, the full name of the on-site museum is now Treblinka Museum, the Nazi German Extermination and Forced Labor Camp 44. So, Treblinka extermination camp, surrounded by monuments of Polish virtue erected by Pilecki Institute people, has become a place where Holocaust de-Judaization and Holocaust envy come together in the triumphant march of Holocaust distortion. Polonizing Auschwitz. A similar process of Polonization is underway in Auschwitz. According to polls, close to 50% of Poles primarily associate Auschwitz with Polish suffering and not with Jewish catastrophe. How is it possible, one can ask, that in a country where the Holocaust was perpetrated, where everybody was aware of the genocide occurring literally in front of them, half of the population believes in pernicious fallacies spun by the authorities? Actually, the phenomenon is not hard to explain, and the memorial techniques are as unsophisticated as successful. In short, Auschwitz I concentration camp is being confused with Auschwitz II Birkenau, which is the extermination site. In 2006, the Polish Sejm Parliament declared 14th of June the National Remembrance Day of the victims of Nazi concentration camps. In 2015, the celebration was renamed the National Remembrance Day for victims of German Nazi concentration and extermination camps. These are small changes, but full of meaning. First, the term Nazi was found to be no longer adequate in the 21st century. Too many people, it was feared, were unable to make an automatic association between the Nazis and the Germans. One had to be more explicit, argued the Polish parliamentarians. Point taken. More importantly, concentration camps, however horrible, were no match in memorial terms for the death camps. In the new memorial reality of European Union, however, the death camps could not be dismissed altogether as it happened in 1950s, 60s and 70s and even 80s. The new commemoration was intended to fill this gap and deliberately confuse concentration and extermination camps, elevating Polish suffering to the desired level of the Holocaust. The date of the celebration commemorates 14th of June. The first transport of ethnic Poles, political prisoners for the most part, who arrived at Auschwitz on 14th of June 1940. With this transport, Auschwitz finally had the desired stamp of Polish suffering and Polish ethnic and national association. What followed the establishment of the new National Remembrance Day was not difficult to predict. On 14th of June 2023, last year, I stood in front of an enormous screen strategically placed at the Warsaw Central Railway Station, one of the busiest spots in Polish capital. On the screen, I saw emaciated figures clad in the characteristic striped clothing of concentration camp inmates. The signs on the screen read, I quote, "Concentration camp Auschwitz was created to exterminate Poles," end quote. The same film was shown over and over again in many Polish cities. Public spaces and bus shelters were covered with huge posters featuring Auschwitz prisoners. The captions read, "My name is Józef Bałuk. I was 51 when the Germans murdered me in Auschwitz because I was a Polish railway worker." And another one, "Poles were the first prisoners of the German death camp in Auschwitz." Each of these statements was either a bold-faced lie or half-lie at best. Concentration camp Auschwitz was not created to exterminate the Poles because the only people exterminated by the Germans at Auschwitz were Jews. Poles were not, I quote, "the first prisoners of the German death camp in Auschwitz," end quote, because they were never sent to the death camp in the first place. And although the Germans did murder many Polish railway workers, they certainly had no policy of killing Polish members of that particular professional group. One needs to constantly remind in Poland that the German genocidal plan targeted the Jews and the Jews only, and that the extermination camps were for Jews, not for Poles, and that the Polish nation thrives while the nation of Polish Jews with its language tradition ceased to exist. That's all. I soon learned this was a statement which I actually published in social media. I soon learned that my statement was entirely unacceptable. An organization called the Institute to Combat Anti-Polonism, funded generously by Polish Ministry of Justice denounced me to prosecutor's office for slandering the good name of the Polish nation. One could hardly ask for a more egregious example of Holocaust envy. What happened in Markowa? I'm watching, I have still 6 minutes and then. What happened at Markowa? In 2016, the Markowa Ulma Family Museum of Poles who saved Jews in World War II opened for business. Markowa is a large village in southeast Poland where the Germans in March of 1944 murdered the Ulmas, a Polish family of 8, parents and children, and 2 Jewish families hiding under their roof. The Ulmas were denounced by their neighbor, a member of collaborationist auxiliary Polish police. The courage and ultimate sacrifice of the Ulma family has been well documented and is at the heart of the museum's exhibition. But the museum is a much more ambitious project. Going beyond the Ulmas, it showcases the rescue efforts of Polish society across the entire region, a vast area in southeast Poland. It stresses the huge involvement of Catholic clergy, the brave deeds of Polish resistance, and of course, the selfless sacrifice of the masses of Polish bystanders who saved their Jewish neighbors during the Holocaust. In short, the Ulma Museum can be best described as a model of Holocaust distortion, where the courageous act of the few are shown as the moral choices of the masses. Holocaust distortion thrives on omission, half-truths, and lack of context, leaving us with a deeply flawed historical narrative. Markowa, for instance, was a large village of about 5,000 people where the final solution of the Jewish question was executed by the locals without any Germans present physically in the area. The concentration and transportation of the local Jews to the nearest German collection point several kilometers distant was done by their Polish neighbors. The vast majority of Jews refused to report to the assembly point as ordered and fled into nearby woods. That's when the manhunts began. Day after day, week after week, month after month, local Polish firefighters and armed peasants combed the woods looking for their Jewish neighbors. Whenever they found them, they robbed them, beat them, and delivered them to the Germans for execution. Sometimes the locals raped Jewish women and killed the men without any German assistance. Unsurprisingly, the museum in Markowa has nothing to say about this aspect of Polish-Jewish relations during the war. The museum is there to convey a message of friendship, sacrifice, and virtue. To understand what really happened in Markowa and why the choices of people like Ulma family were unique, we need to listen to the voices of few survivors, voices that cannot be heard in the Museum of Markowa. Slowly running out of time, so unfortunately I can't read you as many voices as I should, but these voices are haunting and quite horrible. During, for instance, Moshe Welz reported in 1947, I quote, during the Aktion in Sieniawa, some of the Jews escaped and some hid in the bunkers. The Poles knew about it and they organized in their own hunt for the Jews in order to rob them and to murder them. In Markowa, a village close to Łańcuch, the Poles found 28 Jews and they killed them. They took everything. They even pulled out golden teeth from their victims. Yehuda Erlich, another survivor, these were hard times for my host, Gentile hosts. Searches were conducted both by Germans and by Polish peasants themselves who wanted to find the hidden Jews. In the spring of 1944, a Jewish family was discovered hiding with Polish peasants. The Polish family, 8 souls, including a pregnant wife, was killed together with the hidden Jews. As a result, there was enormous panic among the Polish peasants who were hiding the Jews. The next morning, 24 corpses of Jews were discovered in the fields. They had been murdered by the peasants themselves, peasants who had kept them hidden during previous 20 months. Now, these best testimonies, of course, are not visible here. Holocaust is not a part of our history. The Polish Historical Association, or PTH, is the largest and oldest professional association of historians in Poland. The PTH holds its general meetings every 5 years. The last one ended 3 days ago. Over the past 30 years, PTH members have delivered hundreds of papers at these meetings and organized hundreds of panel discussions. They considered the state of research dealing with all periods of Polish history from the Middle Ages until today. The only event which somehow escaped the scrutiny of Polish historians was the Holocaust, arguably the greatest tragedy in Polish history. It is, toute proportion gardée, as if among the thousands of papers presented at the annual meetings of the American Historical Association over the past 3 decades, not one addressed the issue of North American slavery or the destruction of Native American societies. The Holocaust has been so successfully purged from Polish history that its absence does not bother even people who ought to keep the record, Polish historians. The only time the Jewish catastrophe enters the curriculum is when the righteous rescuers need to be mentioned. What can be done? Concluding. For many years, scholars and teachers discussed the future of Holocaust education and its commemoration. The debates revolved around the inevitable passing of the generation of Holocaust survivors. What kind of challenges would we face once the witnesses of the genocide were no longer with us? Who would tell the story? Who would say, I was there, I saw it, it happened to me? Some believed that digitization of historical records was the answer. Others went looking for the last Jewish witnesses who had not yet been heard from. Still others turned to the promises of modern technology, working on interactive 2- and 3-dimensional displays, hoping to attract the attention of the younger generation. The main concern was the threat of a growing indifference towards an event that was more and more distant. Today, we know that indifference to the Holocaust is no longer an issue. The true challenge, one for which most of us are unprepared, is Holocaust distortion. The interest in the history and commemoration of the Shoah is nowadays greater than ever, unfortunately more and more often for all the wrong reasons. Fed by a toxic mix of lies and half-truths and fueled by the enormous resources of the state, the memory of the Shoah is being hijacked by people and institutions wishing to transform the past into usable past, into a past which can not only be reconciled with the tales of own innocence, but can also reinforce these myths. Holocaust denial built on simple lies has now been replaced by a much more dangerous and insidious foe. The assault on the history of the Holocaust needs to be seen as a part of a larger assault on tenets of democratic society. It is needed to stir the nationalistic sense of belonging, to build up the idea of Volksgemeinschaft, and to undermine democratic institutions. Now, what can be done about the sites of Jewish catastrophe which today are progressively taken over by the memorial excesses of the Polish state? Can we allow the sites where millions of Jews have been put to death to become monuments to Polish martyrdom? Perhaps time has come to declare Treblinka, Auschwitz, Bełżec, Sobibór and Chełmno sites of tragic heritage for humanity as a whole. Perhaps given the apparent unwillingness of the Polish authorities to act as honest custodians of the memory of the Holocaust, perhaps the time has come to place these sites under European, United Nations or other international jurisdictions. Exterritorial, like embassies, Auschwitz and Treblinka could become places in which humanity could reflect unhindered on one of the greatest catastrophes in history, on its own tragic heritage, and on its own moral condition, past and present. Thank you.